Hello and welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. In this podcast, I provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, whether that's connected to workplace situations or conflict outside of work. So if you would like access to some additional tools and strategies, etc., related to conflict, please consider pressing subscribe or follow. I'm recording a video as well for the podcast today, so if you'd like to follow on YouTube, feel free. I have noticed that in the podcast, the audio only version of the podcast, there's just this constant lovely growth. It's, gradually, consistently increasing. It's still very small, obviously, but, I've noticed then it's this upward trajectory at least. Whereas on YouTube, there doesn't seem to be an upward trajectory. I've just been dabbling in YouTube, to be honest, and I've noticed that there's a lot of misses in amongst the hits and misses. I thought there might have been a comment the other day, but it turns out that it was just a passing tumbleweed. And when I approached it and offered it some de-escalation skills training, the tumbleweed didn't seem to be interested. So if you would be kind enough to go onto YouTube and make a comment, at least I'll know that there's real humans out there that exist. And you never know, that might be the single positive message that the algorithm needs to actually show my content to somebody else, rather than just letting me continue to check in and sit and see no views, etc. Anyway, as I say, the audio version only of the podcast continues to increase, so that's my focus, at least for now. In the episode today, I'm going to be talking about the topic of some strategies or ways that we can help our children to learn to deal with conflict. My son is 8 years old at the moment, and yesterday I was up at the school because they had an open day. It's like Education Week or something like that, so they invite all of the parents in, and we get to see a little bit of the classrooms and attend an assembly as well, which, sing the school song and sing the national anthem and sit there through all of the different announcements, etc. It's interesting. I have to say it's a bit boring, and every single time I go in and do these open classrooms, my immediate impression is just how gross this whole thing is and how much I would hate to be here in such an overly structured type of environment. But, Louis, my son, doesn't seem to mind so much, so I guess I should probably hold off on my own negative assumptions and realize that this might just be my own negative programming from the experiences I had when I was at school. Anyway, before we went into the classrooms and had this open day type of thing, I got to sit there and observe my son playing soccer. And so it's this chaos. It's a soccer field with a fence outside it. And there's, 7 or 8 different soccer balls all traveling around and kids just running in every direction. It's just complete chaos. And my son is a mild-mannered kind of kid. He's not a rough and tumble sort of person, if you know what I mean. He doesn't like wrestling and stuff. So I'm impressed by the way that he continues to play soccer and just injecting himself into that chaos. I think it's quite impressive, knowing that he's a passive, nervous kind of kid, maybe by nature a little bit. But I've seen his confidence gradually build, and particularly in topics like conflict, I'm really impressed at the way that he handles himself. I noticed yesterday he had these new goalie gloves, these bright green gloves that he's wearing that I took him out to buy on the weekend, and he was so excited. He gets me to put them on because he's not able to put them on by himself. So he arrives at school and, there's only one person who can be goalie effectively, even in amongst all of the chaos. So he needs to be assertive and say, can I have a go? I'm goalie or whatever it is. And he did it yesterday. He stood up to himself, and these are often against kids that are older than him or bigger than him or whatever. So I like that fact that he stands his ground. But I also observed yesterday, he missed a goal and this other kid messed him up kind of thing. And he was dealing with that other kid, I think, in quite an effective way. And honestly, I think sometimes he just let it go. He didn't bother correcting the kid every time the kid was doing something annoying. But when the kid was looking at him and there wasn't as much chaos going on, he did say, look, can we take turns? Or I can't remember what he actually said, but it was some type of a problem-solving approach. So I've been really impressed at watching him develop the skills for dealing with conflict, but he's only 8. And so the other, area of my own experience that I'm drawing from in preparing the episode today is when I used to work in youth crisis centres. When I was studying my degree in psychology, I realized early on that we don't actually get a lot of practical training in, dealing with humans. Like, what do I actually say to someone if I see them in a counselling context, for example? My psychology degree was very much rats and stats, so it was quite a science focus, which was good in a sense. I mean, I have a pretty solid understanding of the fundamentals of neurobiology, but I also needed to figure out a way to develop the soft skills. So for me, I started volunteering at a few different youth crisis centres. They ended up offering me a job, so I worked in drug and alcohol programs. Some of them were like education programs. We were working with kids who were at risk of being ejected from the school system. They'd been suspended a number of times and they were about to be expelled from the schools that they were in. Almost always from just the most horrific and challenging home environments that you can imagine, like family violence and mental health and drug and alcohol and all the rest of it. Parents often in and out of jail and multiple new partners on the scene and then disappearing again, that kind of thing, and various mixes of step siblings and that kind of stuff. And so we would meet them. And one of the challenges for me as a worker in these kind of environments was that there would often be conflict going on with the kids and they didn't know how to manage it. And so even back then, I also needed to take kind of a supportive and coaching approach for helping them maybe become aware of their situation and what they want and think about options for managing conflict differently, because their default a lot of the time was just to fight. You know, as soon as someone would do anything that would upset them or irritate them, they would just lose it. And so I sort of started to think about, well, what do kids need then from parents or maybe caregivers or teachers or other support staff, like I was a youth worker at the time? What kind of approaches tend to be helpful and how can we increase their self-efficacy for dealing with conflict? Like to me, if I want to support someone else who's going through conflict, my son, for example, like he's talking to me about a problem that happened at school, like this kid Ricky was really rough and pushed this guy over and pushed in front of me or something. Like it's really tempting for me as the parent to jump in and tell him what to do. Why don't you say this to Ricky? Why don't you tell a teacher? Why don't you talk to Lucas, your other friend, about it? And then it would be 2 against 1. But of course, as soon as I come in and give him advice, well, first of all, I might not necessarily know the best answer. Like maybe I'm assuming that he should stand up for himself, but in reality, this might be a kid who's all over the shop and has mental health issues, and so there's not much benefit of him engaging this kid. Maybe this is a situation where being avoiding or accommodating might make more sense. So I might make a mistake in the advice that I give him. But even if I give him good advice, and this is actually something that's going to be helpful for him, well, next time there's a problem, next time Ricky does something annoying, he's going to come back to me and say, now, Dad, what should I do now? You know, it's almost like we move into rescuer mode and we let the other person sit as the victim. Like I'm helpless, I'm hopeless, everything else is someone else's fault. And if we come in and solve the problem for them, even if it's just giving them advice, it doesn't necessarily equip them then for managing the next conflict situation that they're going to be dealing with. So for me, I tend to use a 3-step kind of approach. This could be used whether you're raising an issue with somebody, like you want to talk to your son about something that you've noticed, or it might be them coming to you and raising an issue, like, you know, my son comes and talks to me about Ricky. We all have a different style, and as he gets older or when he was younger, I used a different kind of approach. So I'm not necessarily saying that you need to use all of the same words that I do. There might be phrases, etc., that's useful, but you'll have a different style than me, and you've got a different relationship with your kid. But the same principles, or I think the same structure, can tend to be helpful, whether you're dealing with teenagers or maybe even adult children or young kids. So the first step, the initial part, I think, of helping our children to deal with conflict more effectively is listening. And what I'm talking about there is potentially de-escalating. If they're really worked up and upset, you'll need to find a way to bring them back down initially. When we're really ramped up and escalated, we go into this type of fight or flight mode of thinking. So if your child is in that mindset, even if you give them advice, it's not going to register. It's not going to sink in. They're not seeing the situation clearly. They're not thinking about the consequences of their behavior. The left frontal section of their brain that's responsible for things like logic and language and lists, and that's not working, at least to full capacity. They're operating in much more of a unstructured, emotional type of way. So de-escalation is often a really helpful starting point. I think generally speaking, what I'm aiming for here is to acknowledge and validate their perspective. Like if he says, Ricky is such a jerk, he's always mean to everyone, I don't initially jump in to try to challenge his thinking. I'm not saying, is he always mean? I'm sure he's nice sometimes. Or is he nice to some people? Who's he friends with? I'm sure he's not mean to everyone. Like, it's tempting for me to jump in and try to introduce a little bit of nuance. But if I do it too early, what that tends to be interpreted as is it's argumentative, adversarial. Are you sure you're seeing things clearly? It seems like you've missed something here. And of course, when somebody else gets that impression from us, even if it's our kids, they react. And the natural reaction in those kind of situations tends to be defensiveness. So for me, I look at acknowledging and validating. It doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with their perspective, but my initial approach is to say, that makes sense. I can see where you're coming from. Yep, if I was in your shoes, I might very well feel the same way. It's that kind of stuff. From your perspective, from how you see things, from where you sit, this seems like what's going on. I'm not necessarily implying agreement there. I'm attributing actually it to them. It's like, from where you sit, this sounds like your point of view. Have I got that right? And I'm approaching it in a way that's genuinely curious. It's like, can you tell me a bit more about that? Gosh, how long has that been going on for? What's that like for you when that happens? What else? How do other people react around there? So I'm genuinely curious. I'm approaching it in this very open way. And my goal initially isn't necessarily for me to get all of the facts. I think that's the other risk, is that we go into investigative mode and we want to solve the problem and figure out what's going on here. Whereas their understanding of the situation is the goal, not mine. When we use a coaching approach, our aim of awareness is for them to develop awareness. So they come up with the goals, they describe the reality, etc. Now, in this initial process, the acknowledging and validating, the empathetic listening, I like to use the EAR acronym, EAR. The E stands for explore. That's where we might ask those open-ended questions like, far out, what was that like for you? Or what happened next? We can also ask closed-ended questions like, was there a teacher around when that happened? Closed-ended questions have a limited number of responses, or they're yes or no. I actually think it's often helpful to start with a couple of closed-ended questions like, far out, did that happen today? Because they're easy to answer. So if it's an emotional kind of topic that my son's bringing up with me, I want him to be able to start to describe it. Whereas if I ask him too many open-ended questions like, far out, like, tell me a bit more about that, or how did the other kids respond? And he's in the moment thinking, I don't know, Dad, like, I wasn't paying attention to them. What he wants to talk about is how much it hurt when the kid punched him in the stomach or something. And by me accidentally assuming what's important, it tends to get in the way of developing that rapport and that sense of him feeling understood. So I like closed-ended questions because they're easy to answer. They don't take a lot of cognitive processing, if you know what I mean. So when someone's in that escalated fight or flight mode, they're able to answer them, and then maybe leading into a couple of open-ended questions like, what happened next? What was that like for you? How did you respond? I think too many closed-ended questions, the risk there is that it can be a bit like an interrogation. Was there a teacher around? Did you talk to them? Well, what did they say? And of course, that my son or whoever it is that we're talking to might not feel like they're in control of the conversation, at least to the same level. So that's the E, it's exploring. It could be about the questions that you ask. It might be allowing silence. It could be including things like mirroring, like repeating back a few of the words that he said. Ricky was such a jerk today. He was a jerk? Yeah, he was. He constantly was pushing everyone around and demanded that he be goalie and didn't give everyone else a chance or whatever. This repeating back a few of the words that they use, it's this lovely organic way of encouraging someone to keep talking. The second step then is acknowledging, and I think this is often the point where people do feel understood. When you summarize or play back what the person has told you, including your kid or your son or your daughter or whoever it is, it helps them to have a sense that you actually do get it. You'll notice often their shoulders drop and they let out a breath and they say something like, that's right. And that's often a cue for me to move on to the next stage. So that's the first step, helping them to feel understood, that empathetic listening, maybe using the EAR acronym, the explore, acknowledge, and then deciding how we respond. Like maybe you do give them advice, or you ask some coaching questions, or you offer to come and talk to the teacher for them or something. But however you decide to respond, that will be much more effective if you've done the explore and the acknowledge well first. The second step, I think, is that we can help our children think about their thinking. The more I reflect on conflict, communication skills, I'm studying at the moment, I'm doing a diploma of counseling, so I'm learning about different counseling theories, etc. What I'm becoming aware of, at least to me, is that part of what we need for self regulation and part of what we need to improve our capacity for dealing with conflict and communication is awareness. But we don't just need awareness of what I want or what my options are. We need awareness about the meta level. Like, once we can reflect on our thinking, like, what are the patterns in my thinking here? What are the recurring themes? Where are the possible blind spots? How is emotions influencing the decisions that I'm making? What are my natural reactions that come up as a result of what this person's done? Like, what do I want to do? What are my impulses? Which of those are going to be helpful and which of those aren't? Like, unless we can differentiate ourselves from our experience and pause and realize what's going on for us at all of those levels, like my body, my emotions, my thoughts, my perception, my volition, my actions, it really limits our ability to manage our own behavior. So, one of the things that I often do with my son is that I ask him questions about his thinking. Like, I'll say to him, what was going through your mind at the time? What have you been thinking about since? What's sitting there for you at the moment? You know, is there any yucky feelings in your body? Like, what's going on? What do you notice when it's happening? Do you have a tightness in your tummy or a gurgling or something? Or do you feel like your mouth goes dry or you can feel your heart beating in your chest? Like, what's happening? And again, my goal isn't necessarily to get all of this data. Like, I don't need to know what goes on for him. He needs to know what goes on for him, because that's the first step in developing the ability to manage his reactions, is becoming aware of it. So for me, I don't necessarily think there's a right and wrong way to do it. But what I'm doing is encouraging him where possible to reflect on his thinking. What are you guilty about? What's the sense of responsibility? What if you just let it go? Why do you think this keeps coming back to you and interrupting you when you're watching TV or something like that? Was there a boundary that's been crossed? Is there something that you wanted to say that you didn't say? That kind of stuff. So that's the second step to me. It's that, I don't know what you'd call it, thinking about your thinking, meta-analysis, metacognition, meta-reflection, something like that. The third step for me is coaching. And I particularly like the GROW acronym of coaching. I've talked about that before. John Whitmore, I think, in the book Coaching for Performance, outlines this GROW acronym, the GROW, which stands for Goal, Reality, Options, and Way Forward. So we ask questions around each of those four different areas. So a goal question might be to say something like, well, if Ricky does it again tomorrow, how would you like to manage it? Or what's important? Or it sounds like he's pushing in the way of being goalie. Is there a way that you might be able to share it more effectively? Or is it not something that's a big deal to you? Like, what do you make of this? So I'm asking him questions to get him to decide on the priorities, maybe forecasting what might happen and what he would like to do to manage it. We can ask questions about the outcome, like, I want to make sure I get my turn at goalie. But we can also ask questions about his performance, like, you know, when he's trying to get a reaction out of you, what do you want to be able to do in that kind of a moment? Like, I want to be able to stay calm, or I want to know when to talk to the teacher, or I'd like to not let it affect me as much and not take it as personally. Like, they can articulate their goals, and it might be about the outcome or what they can do, their performance. We could then ask questions about the reality, like, how frequently is he doing it? Did it happen for the whole of the lunchtime? What did other people do? Does he always do the same thing? Are there times when it's worse or that it's better? When you've been able to deal with it more effectively, what did you do back then? What stopped you from doing it now? Like, all we're really doing is trying to develop that more nuanced, detailed perspective of the situation, and for them to develop a higher level of awareness. Now, with my son, this often results in him becoming aware of options that he has, but also sometimes becoming aware of how he's contributed to a situation. Like, he might be complaining to me about his friend who was really mean to him, and then all of a sudden, as we ask a few reality questions, it emerges that he was quite rude to his friend earlier in the day, or his friend was having a crap day because he missed out on this award or something, you know. Often there's a flow-on effect, and he's not copying a reaction that's just based on him. There's something else that's going on. And for me, asking him those kind of reality questions, it's a real opportunity for him to shake up that black and white perspective and that story that he was probably telling himself. The third step in that GROW acronym is options. Here we talk about, we ask questions to get them to talk about things that they could do. You could ask them things like, what have you thought about doing? What have you done previously that's worked? Who do you know who's really good at dealing with these kind of situations? What would they do? What advice have you been given? Again, there's no right and wrong, and we're going for quantity over quality here. We just want to get a few options on the table. The reason for that is because we're wanting to teach them how to develop options. Once my son or yours or whoever else you're wanting to support can figure out this problem-solving approach for dealing with conflict or anything else really, it helps them to be empowered, because all of a sudden these issues that come up in the future, they're not necessarily roadblocks, they're just obstacles, and we're going to need to figure out a way to manage it. And then the final step in the acronym is the W, which stands for way forward, or what will you do? So these are questions like, so given all of that, what do you need to do before lunch tomorrow? Or if you're able to speak your mind, what would be the most effective way for you to do that? Like maybe he said, I need to go and talk to Ricky and tell him not to be a bully. So I might then start to problem solve with him preemptively some issues that might come up, like is it worth talking to the teacher about it, do you think? What if Ricky tells you to get lost or something like that? What will you do then? I can also help him flesh out the plan, like what do you need to do to prepare? What support do you need? Is there anything else you need from other people around you, etc.? I could encourage him maybe to think about support networks, like is there anyone else who feels the same way that you do? Would it be an option to talk about it all together? I'm not necessarily needing to know exactly what he does, but the more specific that he can be about the actions that he's going to take, the more likely it is that he'll actually follow through with it. So I don't like someone to walk away just saying something like, thanks, Dad, I'm going to talk to him about it. I often want, at least for his sake, to say, no worries, what do you think will be the best way to do that, or the best way to set that up, or what are the words to use, or are there any particular phrases you think that it would be better to avoid? Not always, but I know that this is going to show him that, the importance of preparation, for example, often results in a better outcome from negotiation. So you can tell I'm dealing with an 8-year-old, but I'm obviously thinking about the clients that I'm talking to every day in conflict resolution skills training and that kind of stuff as well. So those are the 3 steps. Start with an acknowledging and validating, de-escalate if needed, and I like that EAR acronym, explore, acknowledge before you respond. The second step is that meta-analysis, encouraging them to critically think about their own thinking, including things like their emotions, their behaviors, their perception, etc. And then the final step is that coaching approach, the specific issue that they're talking about or the specific person that they're having challenges with, using that GROW acronym. The G for the goal, like how would you like things to be between you and this person? The reality, where are things up to at the moment or what's happened in the past? The options, what do you think you might be able to do moving forward? And then the W, the way forward or the will, where we start to outline the plan in detail. By the way, I also think this is a pretty effective framework for supporting staff or other people who are dealing with conflict as well. But I'd love to know your thoughts. If you've got feedback or questions about the podcast, you can shoot me an email. It's podcast@simongood.com. There's a couple of exciting little announcements in that respect of giving feedback from the podcast. I've moved over to a different podcast host, and now you can actually send me an SMS. So I did a test one yesterday, and it doesn't look like I can give you a reply, but in the show notes, you should be able to see a link or whatever there that says, I don't know, send us a text or something like that. So please feel free to do that if you'd like to just shoot me a message, maybe letting me know who you are, where you're based, and why you listen to the podcast. But if you've got a scenario or a question that you'd like me to cover as well, please feel free to use that too. And then on Spotify and some other podcasting platforms, I know they're also starting to introduce the ability to make comments and have a bit of discussion. I think the default question for each episode at the moment is just, what do you think of the episode? But I would really love it if some people would be willing to make comments. I just find that incredibly useful for me to know what's resonating and how you like the podcast, what stands out to you. Are there any tweaks or options that would make it more useful? Because that helps me to know, of course, which areas to focus on. But it's a funny thing doing podcasts because when I'm doing training workshops, obviously you're seeing people in the room. So you get a sense of what resonates and you pick up on the body language and, lots of coughs or shuffling might be a cue that you need to take a break, or real silent, captivated groups sometimes means that you're on the right track. Whereas when I'm recording podcasts, you don't get any type of feedback. It's a very one directional type of way of communicating, I think. So if you'd be willing to shoot me an email, send me a text, or make a comment on the episode of the podcast, that would be something that I'd be very grateful for over the next week. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in a future episode of the podcast. Bye for now.